Today, the biggest issues in the state and across the nation, according to local voters. We're diving into the issues of housing costs, abortion, and the economy. We're also looking at the latest outlook for registered voters on the candidates for president. And we know there will be a battle for control of the House of Representatives in 2024. Plus, Florida's redistricting battles continue in multiple court cases. A roundtable discussion on This Week in Jacksonville. Thanks for joining us today. So the high cost of housing now the biggest problem Floridians are facing, according to a new University of North Florida poll. That's not the only issue we're facing statewide, though. The poll reveals 26% of respondents saying the cost of housing, the biggest challenge Florida faces right now. 25% say the economy, jobs, inflation tops their list. Education and immigration are tied on the list. Florida's third biggest problem, 9% each there. And the reason we talk about that is because UNF Public Opinion Research Lab faculty director Michael Bender is with us. We're also joined by A.G. Gancarski from Florida Politics and JU Public Policy Institute founder Rick Mullaney, our News4Jax political analyst. So, Dr. Bender, if you just start us here. Obviously, this is a little different, at least my perspective. Usually it's crime is the biggest. It sounded like there was some different focus here on the high cost of housing right now.
Yeah, I don't want to diminish crime. All of our local polls have crime leading the way, but statewide, this is a relatively new phenomenon here in Florida over the last couple of years. And obviously, after the pandemic, prices of housing has increased, and rent obviously with that as well. But certainly, homeowners insurance is really tied into that too, and it's becoming more and more difficult for people to get into the housing market, and maybe for seniors to stay in the housing market.
So I think I want to circle back here. I looked a little deeper on some of the polling results there, and some of that, just explain to all of us what that was when it came to favorability or likability of some of these candidates, specifically the presidential candidates right now.
So we asked just favorability. It's not job approval per se, because we asked about people that aren't necessarily in office right now. And Joe Biden was poor, 34% job favorability.
That was 34%.
34%. That's not good. But comparing him to Trump and DeSantis, were the kind of the 48, 49 range. They were about even. So they weren't great shakes either. And I think that's telling in a lot of the polls that are out there, and maybe people aren't happy with the two leading candidates and what their options might be in the fall.
Yeah, A.G., let me bring you into the conversation here. When you read that poll, when you see what was released there, surprising, not surprising, how do you view some of those numbers when it comes to the favorability of these candidates?
You know, I really wasn't surprised. I think there's sort of a 50-50 feeling about the Republicans. DeSantis' decline to 50% range, is really notable. I mean, he's really squandered a lot of political capital in the last year. He won a transformative election. He basically beat Charlie Crist with a coalition that included independents and Republicans and Democrats, and it looks like that's gone. So that was kind of the big takeaway, how fungible that political capital gets spent.
Governor DeSantis this week, there was a debate. He was one of 4 Republican presidential candidates who faced off in Tuscaloosa, Alabama this past week. But Rick, while we're looking at some of these images from the debate, the Governor DeSantis said, hey, I don't care about polling numbers because, and pointed to just what AG was talking about. Hey, in Florida, I won a big election, and they said there'd be a red wave. There wasn't, but there was in Florida. How surprising are these numbers and the standing for Governor DeSantis in your view?
Well, as AG has said, those polling numbers are from a year ago. There was a red wave in Florida, unlike the rest of the nation. He won by nearly 20 points, which was really a record here in Florida. You saw a red wave in Florida. 1 year later, it is surprising. This poll is surprising as to where he is. And by the way, in that debate, I thought for Governor DeSantis, he had a pretty good night, maybe the best of his 4 debates. Coming out of that debate he had with Gavin Newsom before, a different kind of Governor DeSantis, more energetic, more aggressive, certainly trying to stay on message, great command. But I think if you were to compare a year ago where he was versus today, that change has been dramatic. Dramatic in terms of poll numbers, but also where he is in this race for the presidential primary, which has advantaged Donald Trump.
Yeah. Mike Bender or A.G. Gancarski. What's going on? There's 4 candidates here, but none of them are the one who looks like they're going to be the nominee for Republicans.
Yeah, it's Donald Trump and everybody else. And the thing that's different about this race that we've never seen before is you essentially have an incumbent president. Even though he's not the incumbent currently, he was. And with that comes enormous advantage in these primaries. And that's why you've seen over time, when you have an incumbent president running, they are very rarely seriously challenged. Even Joe Biden, a couple Democrats have tried to get in the race. They've gotten zero traction. They didn't even hold primaries for the Republicans in 2020. So you see this over time. And that's really where Donald Trump is positioned in many ways as a sitting incumbent president.
Yeah, AG, it certainly feels like there's plenty of opposition to the idea that we're going to have a rerun of what happened in 2020.
Right. And, regarding the primaries and regarding the seeming inevitability of Trump, you look at these primary polls in state after state, a lot of winner-take-all setups. Trump's over 40, 50% pretty much everywhere. The ones that are proportional, they're not going to give somebody like DeSantis or Haley, the opportunity to basically make their point. So, it does feel like it's been kind of front-loaded even before people vote, that Donald Trump's got a strategic advantage. And, he built those relationships. 2016, he was president. He moved a lot of people over. He put out a lot of endorsements, and people like him. People in this town like him, for that matter. So, those relationships are long-lasting. I think Trump's reaping the harvest. And there's also the feeling that among Republicans that, Trump shouldn't have lost in 2020. Whether they buy the legitimate election or not, you hear them time and time again say Trump should have had a second term. So there's that kind of vengeance that's in play also.
Well, it was interesting. Chris Christie in the debate last week kind of went all in on, hey, everybody else here, why won't you say what I will say? What he's saying is he doesn't believe Donald Trump is fit to be president. Didn't get much agreement or alignment with the other candidates there.
Well, Chris Christie's out there in many ways by himself, and although there isn't a pathway really for him to the nomination, he had a really good night, I thought. And in particular, in the first question, he said, listen, we're 17 minutes into this debate and everyone's talking to each other and we're ignoring the guy, Donald Trump, who's actually winning this. And he was willing to take him head on. The others less so. You did see Governor DeSantis contrast himself with Trump a little bit more. For example, talking about he failed to build the wall like he promised. He failed to fire Fauci. He, of course, talked about the firing of Wray and that Father Time is not on his side. He's approaching 80 years old. And Nikki Haley took him on the debt and also on China. But overall, if you take a look at the debate last week, but earlier this week, what you saw was they were not willing to take on Donald Trump. They were willing to take on each other. They are trying to be the alternative. So if something happens this spring in that federal trial and there's a conviction, they're hoping that they will be the choice.
And it's important to remember, Christie was getting booed last night when he was saying these things about Donald Trump. So if you're a Republican in that primary, yeah, you might want to tread carefully when attacking him. For his voters will be voting.
Yeah. I want to talk more about some of these issues. As a matter of fact, we touched on it momentarily, but the answer to the question about biggest issues in Florida today, housing costs, we're going to take a look at that. And a topic that seems to present a lot of difficulty for Republicans, abortion. That's next on This Week in Jacksonville.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville with Kent Justice.
Rick Mullaney, A.G. Gancarski, and Dr. Michael Bender with us today. Dr. Bender, the recent UNF poll that you published last week showed that housing costs, the biggest issue that Floridians say is a problem statewide. Housing costs rise. Well, hey, this is a big economic issue, too. I mean, why are housing costs up? That's related to inflation, interest rates, everything else, right?
Yeah, all those things. And people are coming to Florida. We have an increased demand for housing in Florida. And with that, you got to build things. And as we've seen, costs for construction. If you look around town, people were planning on building schools with a $1.9 billion. Maybe now it's $3.9. All these things lead to increased costs, and we have to pay that somewhere. Yeah,
AG, that was certainly a sticker shock moment this week when we heard from Duval County Schools, their chairman, the board chairman, who said, yeah, these costs will confirm are like twice as much as we planned.
Yeah, but you kind of have to expect it because it's a different economic environment. Input costs are more, materials costs are more, labor's more expensive, insurance, all of these issues. So it would follow that the projections when the tax was passed were a bit optimistic. Yeah. But now the school board's going to have to make some choices. What projects will be not delivered on? How's that going to affect them politically? Because we've had a lot of culture war discussions the last few years in the school board, but the capital projects historically were the rubber hits the road. And the school board is going to have to fight for resources they didn't expect to just a couple of years ago.
Yeah, Rick, you've worked in city government as well. Yeah. Boy, for a municipality, when those costs suddenly change, it's a big issue, isn't it?
It's a real problem, but that's the cost side. But let me mention one of the positive aspects, which is the revenue side. And even with the school board projections, you've gone from 1.9 billion to maybe 3.9 billion, but you've seen revenue increase to about 3.5 billion. So on the revenue side, you're getting it, but it is a problem with inflation. And the mayor this past July benefited on the revenue side when you saw a city budget of more than $200 million more than the year before. So you have a cost and revenue problem. But I want to say I really do agree with Michael with this problem on housing. It is a national phenomenon, but there's a Florida problem too. Nationally, we do have this inflation problem. Nationally, the Fed is raising interest rates for all of us, and that's been a challenge when you're looking at a home that's 7.5%. But in Florida, we are the #1 state in the nation for migration of people here. A lot of people are moving here, COVID and post-COVID pandemic in particular. And so for Florida, it is not surprising that it's high on the list, because it is a crisis if you're a young person in Florida and you're just starting out and you're trying to buy a home. The price is high, the interest rates are high, and your wages aren't keeping up with that. That is a real challenge for Floridians, but it's also a challenge for Joe Biden.
Yeah, well, and so let's talk Bidenomics. Is that an issue? I mean, he's saying that this is great for, and really I've heard taking credit for some of the growth that has been bounced back from the pandemic.
Yeah, and listen, jobs, most jobs created ever, all that's real. The problem is, once you've got a job, you're not worried about a job. Now you're worried about, can I pay for all these things? And suddenly you're looking around and it's exceptionally expensive. And it's not just the cost, particularly for housing, but the credit market's tighter. They're looking more closely at who can actually get these loans. So younger folks trying to break in, maybe folks that Biden might be relying on to show up and vote for him, they might be a little bit hesitant. They're not seeing the benefits.
Yeah. Let me shift topics a little bit. Explain to us what you found, the results in your survey about abortion, and what the question was and what some of the results were there.
Yeah, we've been asking about abortion the last couple of years, particularly since the state's gotten involved in restricting it. And we asked, there's a ballot measure that's being circulated, collecting signatures. So we asked that ballot measure, basically it's, do you want to prohibit governments from restricting abortions prior to viability? And 62% of the folks said, yeah, we would support that ballot measure. And that's...
Is that partisan at all?
Well, you'd think, right, oh, it's all Democrats, maybe some independents. The irony is, 53% of Republicans said yes, too. And that's a really big, meaningful number. Now, in Florida, you need 60% plus one to pass any of these constitutional amendments. But with support from Republicans, that puts Republicans in a little bit of a pickle with how you handle this issue statewide.
Yeah, so AG, let's talk about the races that we'll see in 2024. Is abortion going to be a very tough spot for the conservatives?
I think abortion is going to be a turnout driver for Democrats, and they definitely need one given Biden's weakness. It's going to be something that creates a backlash and wedge issue. I think it's going to be tough for a Republican presidential candidate to message it. Rick Scott running for re-election is going to have a tough time messaging it because, the feeling of the people, and the poll documents it, is that Ron DeSantis went too far with the 6-week abortion ban. They sold the 15-week ban as being reasonable, and then they come back when they have more political capital for a 6-week. And I think that undermined a restrictionist position. It could put this amendment very close to passing. There's also the legalized marijuana amendment that looks like it could pass or not. I mean, support always declines when you get closer to elections with these things. But, in the short term, these amendments look good. And, around the country, these amendments, abortion amendments and marijuana amendments, are both doing well.
Yeah. So what do you think, Rick?
Kent, I think very well abortion may be the #1 challenge facing Republicans in 2024, both nationally and in Florida. And usually it's the economy, stupid, and I understand that, but the Democrats have been very effective on taking the abortion issue and making it more than just an abortion issue. It's about freedom, it's about the intrusion of government. Take a look at recent elections in conservative states, in Ohio, in Kentucky, in Kansas, in Purple State, in Virginia, all of them being affected by this issue. I think, and I agree with AG, that the Republicans and Governor DeSantis taking it from 15 weeks to 6 weeks was a political mistake. We're not talking about the merits of the policy, we're talking about the politics of the policy. And that's reflected in the poll.
Too aggressive? Is that
it goes too far politically as to where the country is. And in the national debate on the Republican side, I think Nikki Haley has done the best job of trying to take that look at trying to diffuse that issue and trying to build consensus. But for the Republicans, unless they can find a way to address this issue, it's going to be, I think, their top challenge in 2024. Normally, in these circumstances, with these challenges economically, with inflation, with the economy, with what's going on with two different wars, you would think it's advantage Republicans. But the abortion issue is a big challenge for Republicans. We've seen it in recent elections. We saw it in the 2022 midterms. We're going to see it in the 2024 midterms, and it can potentially be a big issue in the presidential election.
Thank you. All right, so everybody, we've got one more segment, and we've got time to talk about the redistricting battles. That's next on This Week in Jacksonville. Stay with us.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville on Channel 4.
AG Gancarski, Rick Mullaney, Michael Bender with us today. So let's pick up our final few minutes on the topic of district maps. So the battles continue, and they've got an impact on representation both in the Florida House and Senate and AG congressional maps as well. There's two different cases here, but this impacts what happens in 2024.
Yeah, and the latest piece of news here is the First District Court of Appeal threw out challenge to map. So basically, we're going to see the status quo congressional map through the 2024 election. Aaron Bean and John Rutherford will split Jacksonville. You won't have that traditional minority access congressional seat. And, the Congress is so closely divided, just a few seats divided, that, this matters for, what goes forward. But, what I'm looking for is future challenges to the current congressional map. It was something that Ron DeSantis pushed through in 2022. It was seen by many critics as a bad faith measure. It takes away representation from African Americans and so on. So it's ripe for challenge.
So let me show you this. Many of us familiar with the change. The old District 5 map where Al Lawson won the seat stretched across the northern part of the state all the way to Tallahassee. The current district lines reorganized essentially replaced District 5 with a newly named District 4. New district has all of Clay, all of Nassau, part of Duval County. Aaron Bean won that seat in last year's election. So to AG's point, takes away some representation for African Americans. A couple different cases. Why does this take so long? That's what I just asked a moment ago.
Well, a couple things. One is it's contentious. The governor contends that this is unconstitutional gerrymandering, racial gerrymandering. The argument against that is that you are diluting minority representation and you're denying people the right to vote for the candidate of their choice. But you get this litigated after all these cycles, and you have litigation going on both in state court. The First District Court of Appeal, of course, is a state court that goes to the Florida Supreme Court, and you have federal litigation going on. And the federal litigation has been inconsistent too. And so you have very strong competing demands, but go back to something AG said. Very consequential on the maps for the balance of power in Congress. When you look at the current House of Representatives and the departure upcoming of McCarthy, and you take a look at Santos, it's going to leave you with a two-person majority. In Florida alone, in 2022, could make a difference for the balance of power in the United States House of Representatives. So the consequences and the stakes are very, very high, and this will continue in federal and state court litigation.
Well, and in 2022, Florida added Republicans in congressional seats. This is something that seems like really needs to be addressed soon, but it's taking a while.
It does, and if you think about qualifying, primaries in August, you have to qualify several months before that. In order to get these things done, they got to be done soon, and they're not. They're taking time. The state Supreme Court hasn't indicated that they're going to hear the case. I don't know if they ultimately will or not. Politically, it might make sense not to, because they can get the desired outcome they want. But there might be some precedent issues, because the current case, I say current, so it was a decision that threw out the maps.
Right.
Then we just overturned that decision, so we're not there yet. But there's still a process to be played out in the state level. And again, working with state bureaucracy, it can go slowly.
So, AG, I want to bring you in on something that just happened this last week. So we found out that Angie Nixon, who's a state representative representing Jacksonville, now has a challenger for the primary coming up, former city council member, former school board member, Brenda Priestley Jackson. Why is that happening?
Yeah, that's a very interesting challenge. It's House District 13, which is on the north and west side of Jacksonville. And, basically Priestley Jackson thinks that Nixon hasn't gotten much done in the legislature, hasn't gotten many bills passed, isn't good for appropriations, and she's going to have bipartisan backing. because, on city council and school board, she worked across party lines. Angie Nixon doesn't really do that in the same way. And so I'm expecting Republican assets to help. I think Nixon does well in that district and probably has a stronger appeal to Riverside, Avondale, and so on. But what's going to happen is eventually the primary will be closed this summer, basically restricting only Democrats to vote. So it's going to be interesting to see how Priestley Jackson works the entire district.
Yeah, they certainly have different backgrounds, different personalities, different ways that they work. So it's going to give those people voting, it'll give them choices, right? They are two different folks. Listen, I appreciate that we got a chance to talk about a variety of issues here. And Dr. Bender, great work, Public Opinion Research Lab there at UNF, obviously giving us a chance to talk through, hey, what are people thinking? What are trends we see? AG, appreciate your work at Florida Politics and always what you bring to us as our political analyst for News4JAX. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for having us.
All right, so as we wrap up today, we want you to know we've launched a version of This Week in Jacksonville. It's called Business Edition, and it's a podcast that focuses on economic development of the River City and throughout our region. This episode this week, looking at small businesses and the opportunities available right now to entrepreneurs. You can find new episodes every Thursday at 9 a.m., and then you'll find it right now on News4JAX Plus under the channel This Week in Jacksonville. You also find This Week in Jacksonville Business Edition available wherever you find your podcast, like Apple, Spotify, Google, those sorts of places. All right, our final show of the year is coming up next week. Chris Hand will join me as we look ahead to 2024. I'm Kent Justice. Thanks for watching on air on Channel 4 and the CW17. And then you'll find us online at news4jax.com or streaming on News4JAX Plus. Have a great week.
Every day, more people are choosing News4JAX, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.